We'll begin with a reading from the section we're going to discuss today. This is aphorism number 463 of Human All Too Human, entitled A Delusion in the Theory of Subversion. Quote, "There are political and social visionaries who hotly and eloquently demand the overthrow of all orders in the belief that the proudest temple of fair humanity would then immediately rise up on its own. In these dangerous dreams there is still the echoes of Rousseau's superstition, which believes in a wondrous, innate, but as it were, repressed goodness of human nature, and attributes all the blame for that repression to the institutions of culture, in society, state, and education. Unfortunately, we know from historical experience that every such overthrow once more resurrects the wildest energies, the long since buried horrors and extravagances of the most distant times. An overthrow can be a source of energy in an exhausted human race, but it can never be an organizer, architect, artist, perfecter of human character. It is not Voltaire's temperate nature, inclined to organizing, cleansing, and restructuring, but rather Rousseau's passionate idiocies and half-truths that have called awake the optimistic spirit of revolution, counter to which I shout, écrasez l'infâme, crush the damn thing. Because of him, the spirit of enlightenment and of progressive development has been scared off for a long time to come. Let us see, each one for himself, whether it is not possible to call it back again." End quote. I love this passage for so many reasons. For one, Nietzsche throws us for a loop at the end, right? He criticizes Rousseau, but for impeding the progress of the Enlightenment. Nietzsche is usually considered as a critic of the Enlightenment, but at this time in his career, he somewhat identified with it. There's a very subtle meaning to this sort of shift in his thought that I think will become clear in the course of this episode, but we could say provisionally, Nietzsche has to fully identify with and complete the task of the Enlightenment in order to transcend it, sort of the case that I'll make. But furthermore, we see that direct rebuke to Rousseau and a favorable view of Voltaire in comparison. Voltaire has often been blamed for the French Revolution alongside Rousseau, but here Nietzsche is in fact making a distinction and exonerating him and upholding Voltaire's model as an individual, right? His more contemplative image as a man of culture. And here we find the key to unlock this riddle, I think, that Nietzsche is up to this point an advocate for culture, like throughout his period of the Untimely Meditations essays. He sees it as the fruit of the political structure. And people like Rousseau completely attack that. They threaten to destroy the entire harvest of human civilization, right? Because of a distorted view of the freedom and equity of man in his natural state that they perceive existing in the natural state. And so Rousseau gives half-truths, Nietzsche says, because he sees the ways in which Rousseau hits the same marks that Nietzsche does, but comes to a completely divergent conclusion when he remarks on the horrors and the extravagances of distant times that Rousseau is calling back. We cannot help but think of Nietzsche's work in Homer's Contest and the Greek state, where he spoke of the abysses of cruelty in the human heart that were unchecked in those days, and the voluptuousness of the Greeks' hatred for their enemies, that every ancient society on earth celebrated festivals in which cruelty was a large part, that blood sacrifices and torturous deaths were commonplace. And Nietzsche is contrasting this with Rousseau's more Edenic view of nature, and suggesting, as quite a negative, that this is what would actually emerge if human nature were allowed to run wild. And so the passage is in keeping with Nietzsche's brute realist conception of how power works, that in absentia of order, people don't fall into a natural harmony, but the state is the iron clamp that prevents the war of all against all from discharging itself all over the place. It focuses the spirit of domination into things like competition, or into it focuses all these competing wills into a collective identification in which the group can struggle against outside enemies. But for Nietzsche, no naturally peaceable state exists prior to the state of civilization, right? And if it did, why would we ever have proceeded into a warlike state of affairs to begin with? There must naturally have been some push, some drive, some advantage to warlike behavior, and if that were the case, then human nature would naturally develop according to that selection pressure. In some sense, then, Nietzsche finds a strange agreement with Kant here, that peace is not the absence of war, but must actively be created by force. The section that this interesting passage is from is in Human All Too Human, as I mentioned, and it's entitled A Glance at the State. After all of the discussion on Nietzsche's political ideas that we've covered, A Glance at the State is the first thing he publishes, which is explicitly devoted to politics. I mean, yes, his political ideas are influenced by the work that he does on theogonies, but those essays he writes about theogonies were written for the philological community. They're actually not terribly political in and of themselves, right? And they were never intended to be of interest to the public at large. It is true that Nietzsche makes scattered political remarks throughout, say, Birth of Tragedy and The Untimely Meditations, but there's no extended section of work exclusively devoted to politics in this period. Politics is secondary if considered at all. The focus is on art, culture, education, on these things instead. And we looked at the essay, The Greek State, in a past episode, which is pretty, it's a straightforwardly political text in some sense. It's an analysis of the Greek polity and as an analysis of how its purpose might be understood by the ancient Greeks. But that section was removed from Birth of Tragedy. It was never published. We only have it through the Nachlass, the collection of unpublished notes. So Nietzsche doesn't therefore attempt to lay out his political positions in any detail until the time of Human All Too Human, where we find this section, A Glance at the State. And considering that this is the first focused political statement of Nietzsche's, the ideas presented here are relatively disconnected from one another. The section is unsystematic. Nietzsche doesn't attempt to build a foundation for a political theory here. He merely makes a number of observational remarks in the style of La Rochefoucauld or, for that matter, Machiavelli. Nevertheless, I would argue that the aphorisms in A Glance at the State do cohere with each other if we understand them in context with Nietzsche's project at the time and the development of his thought. That's the most interesting thing about Human All Too Human from my perspective. It's a snapshot of where Nietzsche is at a very specific time in his career. It's a period of experimentation and willingness to entertain all sorts of ideas from all sorts of places. So we'll take a moment and examine that broader context. We've seen from looking at Nietzsche's work on theogonies and his comments during the time of Birth of Tragedy that we can characterize many of Nietzsche's foundational principles in politics as aristocratic in outlook. There's really no better word for it. That's what characterizes the beginnings of his philosophical thought, essentially a form of classical conservatism, but with an even more radical bent, in which the genius or the great individual and the great works of art and culture are seen as the point of the state, rather than, say, the harmony of society or the other teloi that had been proposed for the state by other theorists throughout history, such as most notably Plato, like we talked about. And when we look to the last years of Nietzsche's career, so that was the beginning point, we look at the end point, we find roughly the same theme. We might look to the last chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, entitled What is Noble? I mean, his entire work on the master and slave morality and the genealogy sort of has this bent to it, and some of his political statements in Twilight of Idols, his last work meant to sum up his philosophy or provide an introduction to it, contain political remarks like this also. So Nietzsche begins and ends in pretty much the same place. But the argument that he's making at the end of his career it exists at a sort of a higher level, so to speak. So at first his thought is, it seems to me, simply shaped by this series of influences, many from the ancient world, and he associates himself with the morality of the Greek nobility. But then Nietzsche begins his project of metaphysical and moral questioning. That's the middle period. During this time, it's Nietzsche's age of comparisons, his task to contrast the moralities of the world, right, with one another, and the moralities throughout history. And this applies to the political sphere too. Nietzsche considers and criticizes a variety of political perspectives, and he critically examines his own influences, and he experiments with ideas and works out general principles of his thought through this process. That's how he works up to his own revaluation of values. And so when he lands in roughly the same place at the end of his career, Nietzsche's politics is nevertheless more considered, it's less naive, it's more nuanced, but it's no less radical. Because in the end, he more or less returns to advocacy for the morality of the Greek nobility. Although, at the end point, the main difference is that he has a more sophisticated understanding of what morality itself is. His later viewpoint emerges within this new understanding of the perspectival nature of moral viewpoints, and that there's no absolute perceiver, and that an understanding of the idea that the moral perspective which one holds is determined by these factors which are necessary and determined that make up who and what you are, that what we think is determined by this perspective, determined by who and what we are, and a large part of that is our position within the power relationships. So he has this much broader descriptive understanding of what morality is. He therefore asserts this new morality, which we could call Dionysian, but he does so in a very different way than he would have asserted it at the beginning of his career. All that work he's done, the discovery of the will to power, the idea of the eternal return, it all changes Nietzsche's outlook on what morality is and even on what philosophy is. And so that applies to his understanding of politics. Now, so we're going to go over the middle period. Starting today, we're going to begin proceeding through the political writings of the middle period. And that's where you can see the most development of Nietzsche's thought. It's a convalescence, as Nietzsche describes it. It's a period of criticism, which is a necessary step in the progress of his ideas because it's a sort of a means of recovery. He sees this period as taking his first steps away from Wagnerianism. He's recovering from Wagnerianism as from a disease, right? He compares it to an affliction with a long illness. And so he's getting over Wagnerianism, he's gotten over Prussianism, he's getting over common ideas or things that he might have been enculturated to believe within the academy. And we find in this period, as he sort of takes these stances where he turns and critically examines all of these views that he used to hold, there still is the emergence of his affirmative philosophy in this period because there's sort of the recognizable shapes of later ideas as they start to form. The notion of the good European appears in this text, in Human All Too Human, and the notion of the free spirit also. And there are some ways in which Nietzsche really isn't that different from his earlier or later selves. He's as critical of democracy as ever. Although, since we've been following along with sort of a rough sketch of some of the heavy hitters in the history of political philosophy, that's actually a more typical opinion among philosophers than an atypical one. So Nietzsche is really not that revolutionary in that respect. Another sense in which his view is also very similar to those of his contemporaries, but starkly different from our own, is his attitude towards war. If Nietzsche comes out sounding mostly positive about anything in this section, it would probably be war. The middle period of Nietzsche's is traditionally considered to run from Human All Too Human to Daybreak, and then to the first 4 books of the Gay Science. These books represent Nietzsche's campaign against metaphysics, against morality, and then finally against Christian values and the Christian religion as such. The middle period culminates in the death of God, and that work leads directly into Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy as he lays it out in Zarathustra. His task to create a new set of values to say yes to. And so that project emerges at the end of the Gay Science. But before that new value structure can be created, Nietzsche had to clear the ground for it. He had to prepare the earth for the overman, so to speak, right? Wipe away the prejudices and assumptions that were sort of like the weeds and overgrowth. And so during this time, there's to some extent a departure from these earlier views. He has less total identification with the antica morale, the morality of antiquity. Nietzsche in Human All Too Human and throughout the middle period says some things that are at variance with his later self. But these contradictions are part of this process of destruction. He inhabits both sides of every binary and consequently begins to see how the two opposite poles depend on one another. He starts to understand things like the relativity of opposites. He makes attempts to follow his starting principles to their final conclusion, to push them to the absolute limit as a sort of test of their strength. And he undermines, negates, and refutes with a great zealousness during this period. And the content is overwhelmingly critical rather than affirmative. So we'll zero in on Human All Too Human, which is this episode's focus. When Nietzsche writes this book, he's just broken with Wagner. He writes the first draft of the work while on a personal retreat in the forest immediately after his early departure from the Bayreuth Festival of 1876. When he finally publishes the work, Wagner is disturbed to find a dedication to Voltaire. The quotation, "Error, my friend, has its virtues too." Nietzsche would later remove this dedication in future editions, and famously he would look back on all the books of this period with some regret. He'd made some remarks about wanting to have them all destroyed, but eventually settled on writing new prefaces for them, in which he contextualizes them as steps forward in a recovery. He uses the term convalescence, I think, in his prefaces to all of them. And I think that was a beautiful decision on Nietzsche's part. The important thing to take away from all of this, of his ambivalence about this period, is that he was willing to learn from his mistakes, right? As he shows us. He was even willing to take the works that didn't fully represent his thought as it developed, but then sort of bless them rather than destroy them, christen them as necessary for his intellectual development, as steps on the path that he had to walk. And so Human All Too Human begins with a critique of metaphysics. Nietzsche was certainly used to unconventional metaphysics by the time of, his work of concerning the pre-Platonic philosophers. But his outlook, even in Birth of Tragedy, is still metaphysical, right? He describes it as an artist's metaphysics. He's willing to entertain ideas about the ontological world as a place of primordial pain and contradiction. The world of the senses, he's willing to talk about it as only a represented world, as Schopenhauer and Kant had done. And his Apollo and Dionysus figures symbolize, on the other hand, the creation of a representational reality and the dissolution of that reality. And so that would be Apollo would be sort of the creation of the representation. Dionysus is its dissolving. And consequently then the merging with the noumenal world, which Nietzsche identifies with something akin to Schopenhauer's will. The noumenon is considered this kind of tortured dualistic monism, which that remark probably would only make sense if you've read Birth of Tragedy, which you can do. We've talked about it on the podcast. I did like an 8-part analysis of it, so go back and listen to that if you're interested. But even here, Dionysus as a symbol for Nietzsche suggests the possibility of metaphysics itself breaking down, along with the breaking down of all barriers and categories, through the power of aesthetics, through the power of an artistic view of the world. But in Human All Too Human, Nietzsche goes farther. He takes it a step further. He takes his first peek behind the curtain of thought, so to speak, and sees how the operation of language influences us to conceive of the world in certain ways that have more to do with our grammar and less to do with objective reality. It has to do with the structure of our thinking, how we represent the world. And so he questions, for example, whether there are any opposites at all. He suggests, for another example, that all numbers are the equation of unequal things. And then he even commits the, immorality of suggesting that all of our selfless actions might have their root in selfishness, and that our most beautiful self-abnegations and acts of charity might have their origin in vanity. And so he prefigures many of the critiques of metaphysics and morality that he would later make in Beyond Good and Evil, and a couple other works as well. His view toward religion in Human All Too Human takes for granted that the scientific revolutions of the Enlightenment have made a transition away from religious thought inevitable. Though, as for the sort of cataclysmic effect that Nietzsche would later predict that this would have. He doesn't yet consider it. And perhaps he didn't really perceive it yet. He didn't perceive how much depended on the Christian God, such as he says later, our entire European morality. But here in Human All Too Human, he seems to echo the French Enlightenment figures that a transition to a truly scientific and philosophical way of life is a desirable way forward. He's not dismissive of religion and respects it as a powerful social force, but he treats religion as something which an aristocracy must use in order to remain in power. And in that respect, he echoes Machiavelli. And so there's a curious blending of influences in this book. It's as much a child of Voltaire as Machiavelli. It's as much influenced by Fontenelle as Thucydides. In the last section of the book, in the very first aphorism of that section, he writes, quote, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies," end quote. And that's the theme that I think persists throughout the book. That sort of sums up his attitude. Convictions are what the free spirit must constantly be on guard against and actively attack even. And as such, this could be considered Nietzsche's lion phase, to use the metaphor from Zarathustra's Metamorphoses of the Spirit. Nietzsche is putting into practice this ideal, make an enemy of your own happiness, make attacks upon one's own teachers, make an attack upon one's own convictions. That's another aphorism he has about convictions in Human All Too Human, where he says, it's quite one thing to have courage of your convictions, but what's really necessary is to have courage for an attack on one's convictions. And another theme throughout is that what human beings choose to believe in is not determined by a commitment to truth-seeking. It's not, determined from the will to truth, but rather by what gives us pleasure. This is an early version. It's the earliest prototypical version where he's actually saying a different thing, but he's grasping towards this idea of beneath your will to truth, there's also a will to power that is more fundamental, that the will to truth is a derivation of. And so, but here he has he's using the pleasure principle and says this is what shapes the things that we believe in. That in fact, what we believe has very little to do with the dispassionate scientific pursuit of the truth, but what makes us happy and comfortable, right? Now, that framing doesn't exactly have the same meaning as the will to power idea, but Nietzsche hadn't created that yet. In this work, though, there's already a hint that there might be some deeper principle than pleasure in the narrow sense, because another aspect that he talks about throughout the whole text is vanity, of our self-image as of great importance to human beings, and that many of the things that people do that are apparently moral actions or might apparently have some other motive can be understood as a form of vanity. And so, in fact, vanity might even often compel us to supersede our pleasure seeking, right? That's a way to put it, which indicates that what's driving us is not exactly pleasure, it's not exactly vanity, but something else which he hasn't yet identified, which he'd later call will to power. Nevertheless, what he's doing here is significant, and it would be significant in my opinion, even if he never wrote anything else, because Human All Too Human introduces that critical perspective of Nietzsche as regards our will to truth, right? As we've mentioned, that in spite of Nietzsche's exaltations to pursue a more scientific, philosophical approach to life, which is everywhere in this text, we encounter that framing of truth-seeking as driven by something else, whether it's vanity or pleasure or whatever. That the unself-interested reasoning that, for example, Kant demands of us is something that Nietzsche doesn't really think is possible. And so this is another idea that appears in Human All Too Human first, but would become very important throughout Nietzsche's career, which is that truth rests on a foundation of ignorance. That to put the desire for truth into terms of understanding it in terms of pleasure, right, or seeking our happiness, Nietzsche is pointing to, in some sense, the fact that truth-seeking is an impulse, it's a passion, it's a desire, it's something that is itself irrational and simply wants to be fulfilled. It's a drive. And so he's already sort of expanding the meaning of pleasure, not just physical pleasure, but psychological pleasure. And what, we might include it to gaining advantage over yourself or over your environment. And that, in a way, we see how it flows into the will to power idea, because the most expansive sense of the term pleasure that we could come up with would probably end up being roughly analogous to Nietzsche's later concept of power or will to power. So one example within the text that we might use, Nietzsche compares the way we see the guilt of a criminal who intentionally murders versus a man who kills in self-defense, right? What Nietzsche says is that, in some sense, even for the murderer, it's always a matter of self-defense. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, that every action that we take is a necessary outflow of our own nature, that our impulses push us to demand and attempt to gain our own form of pleasure in the world, and that if some obstacle stands in the way of our desires, it's a necessary eventuality that we'll lash out and attempt to destroy that obstacle. That if there's some obstacle preventing us from fulfilling the pleasure that our impulses lead us to attempt to gain, that this is necessarily an attack upon what we are. And so it's always a matter of self-defense. So that's just a rough outline of how Nietzsche's conceptual world, just sort of the rough outline of some of the framework that he's working with. Now, we'll move on to the political aspects. Again, I would argue his political views don't differ so tremendously from his later work. He still has these beliefs that we can see come out here in the sections we'll look at today. The order of rank, the pathos of distance, and so on and so forth. We see all of that in this text. But he's more conciliatory toward modernity here, and toward the ideas of Voltaire and the French Enlightenment. He seems more willing to consider the various modern ideas as to how Europe could or should develop, and kind of gives them their due. And at times it almost seems like he's arguing with himself, and at times it seems like he's trying to reconcile something with himself. And it's actually, if I might admit, probably my favorite period of Nietzsche's political thought, because to me he draws the most interesting conclusions. To me, his aristocratic radicalism, because it's so foreign and different from the way we think about the world today, is a very interesting idea to study, to see how he developed that idea and why he came to those beliefs. Because if you can inhabit that viewpoint, you'll have climbed a mountain of perspectivism, right? But this is the angle. But I would say, so studying his influences and studying how he gets there is very interesting to me. But the conclusions are not so interesting. They don't seem as easy to implement or as relevant to implement in the modern age. And what you end up with is sort of this Epicureanism, right? Of, retreat from society then. The middle period, I think, is a lot more interesting because Nietzsche seems a little bit more open-minded. Now, you could make an argument as to whether or not some of his beliefs here can actually be reconciled with his mature philosophy, with sort of the fundamental principles of it, like will to power. And I'm not exactly sure, but we'll leave that aside, right? The strangest aspect of this period of his work, when we compare it to later Nietzsche, or even to earlier Nietzsche, is that he actually seems invested in the political questions of his contemporaries. Right? I mean, he spends his academic career more focused on political questions that concern the Greeks, like the political questions of 2,500 years ago. And then during his untimely meditations, he still tends to treat politics in a like fashion. That most of the political questions he wrestles with are these timeless values that transcend the age. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with his cyclical view of history, his desire to bring our actual lives to the forefront of value, and then this anti-political Epicurean streak. And so he has this desire to wage a cultural war rather than a political one. And so he's going to get down to the root of these values questions and attempt to attack on that level. But the practical political concerns of his time don't really interest him. And so he doesn't usually give advice to those with political ambitions or entertain if-then statements, such as, if the socialists want to succeed, then this is what they should do, right? Except he does do this in the middle period. And even here, there's a disdain for party politics that colors the whole thing. It's like Nietzsche is hesitantly and contemptuously wading into the muck. But usually he isn't even willing to do that, right? Which is what makes the writings in the middle period so interesting to me. He actually seems to wrestle with and seriously consider some practical questions of politics. Now, on to the text. These are some of what I would consider the significant aphorisms in this section, and I think hopefully we'll cover enough angles of Nietzsche's rather unsystematic thought in this section for you to get as complete a view as possible. This section begins with an attack on democracy, particularly on partisan politics and the incentive structure by which partisanship is driven. By their nature, political parties acquire their power by rallying the most people to their side. And in order to do this, even though everyone is not stupid, it's still to frame the issues and the positions in the stupidest possible way. Because you have to appeal to the greatest number of people. You want your political slogan to be such that everyone can understand it. And so political candidates don't campaign with a slogan about the specifics of their policy agenda. They don't campaign on what they think the tax rate should be, or whether they interpret the Constitution as an originalist or a textualist. Those details are not important for political messaging, and they can lead to an uncomfortable complications and nuance, right? No, the intellectuals can grasp the simplest message, but the simplest people will not grasp the most intellectual message. We could put it like that. So it behooves you to make everything simple. A political party is incentivized to communicate in this way, such that it disseminates simple, or dare we say stupid, iterations of their own ideas. So Nietzsche writes in number 438, quote, "All political parties today have in common a demagogic character and the intention of influencing the masses. Because of this intention, all of them are obliged to transform their principles into great frescoes of stupidity and paint them that way on the wall. Nothing can be changed about this. Indeed, it is superfluous even to lift a finger against it, for what Voltaire says applies here. Once the populace gets involved in reasoning, all is lost. Now that this has happened, one must adapt to the new conditions, as one adapts when an earthquake has moved the old limits and outlines of the land and changed the value of property." End quote. So again, understand, this doesn't mean everyone in the populace are stupid. I mean, maybe a great number of them are, but a lot of them aren't. Maybe even the majority aren't, right? The problem is that the system incentivizes lowbrow communication. It makes the arena in which that communication occurs, therefore, a lowbrow arena. And it's the incentives of democracy that play to that lowest common denominator. And then, therefore, what it brings out into the discourse, what it manifests, are the most mediocre, simple, and common sensibilities of society. And then it makes those things, it then grants the most power to those mediocre, simple, common sensibilities, sentiments, and values. Furthermore, however, as Nietzsche says, we have to adapt to this new condition. To lift a finger against it is folly, right? There's a subtle double entendre there too, I think, where he's talking about that the value of property is changed in his earthquake metaphor. And why is this? Because the legitimacy of property itself had been challenged. The property question at the time was one of the big political questions in Europe. For the first time, socialism and democracy are taken seriously as political movements. And everywhere the old monarchies are either afraid of socialism or fighting socialism or making concessions to it. Basically, there's no polity in Europe in the 19th century that is untouched by this political movement. And they respond in various ways. And the socialists, they don't have all that much success, but they're successful enough in that everyone has to respond. Okay, so to continue with the text. Quote, "If the business of all politics is to make life tolerable for the greatest number, this greatest number may also determine what they understand by a tolerable life. If they think their intellect capable of finding the right means to this goal, what good would it do to doubt it? They simply want to be architects of their own fortune and misfortune. And if this feeling of self-determination, this pride in the 5 or 6 concepts their heads contain and can bring to light, does indeed make their life so agreeable that they gladly bear the fatal consequences of their narrowness, then there is little to object to, provided that their narrowness does not go so far as to demand that everything should become politics in their sense, and that everyone should live and act according to their standard. Some people must be allowed to keep out of politics and stand aside a little." End quote. So again, we have the sentiment of not challenging democracy. But there's a tinge here of mockery, right? It's analogous to your friend saying, "Hold my beer," before he goes to do something stupid. He goes to try and do a backflip off the front of a motorboat, right, as it's moving. And I'm going to do a backflip off and swim underneath it. It's like one friend saying, "Should I stop him?" And the other saying, "No, just stand aside and let it happen," right? So when Nietzsche says stand aside, he's not exactly making peace with democracy here. In a way, he's predicting that it will bear fatal consequences. And he says, in perhaps a similar way to his suggestion that our illusions about the dignity of labor are actually an advantage over the Greeks, maybe this mindset of self-determination that democracy nourishes will also have good consequences, i.e. maybe the populace will take ownership over their fate and accept their responsibility for it, right? So there's an aspect of Nietzsche, again, being conciliatory, even as he's somewhat mocking of democracy. Although, in all seriousness, I mean, there are very few things that I would consider less realistic than the populace at large, like taking responsibility for anything. But I digress. So furthermore, Nietzsche emphasizes this inevitable narrowness of the democratic man, right? The 5 or 6 concepts that the most average person can bear in their head. And again, it isn't even the values of one person or another that's at issue here, but the values of the masses as they emerge in mass politics. Nietzsche's theory of the case that we see throughout is that they will always be the most average values among that populace, such that it'll be the issues that affect the most people, the moral considerations of most people, manifesting across the various demographics and regions. Those are the values that will obtain in power. And so the average person, as we're talking about him here, is not a real person, but a kind of collective subject, if I can use the Hegelian term, I believe. That's who democracy serves, an abstract subject rather than any one concrete individual or even a collection of individuals. And so in utilitarian concerns, life being tolerable, right, for the greatest number, Nietzsche's pointing out that this utilitarian concern has to concern itself with quote-unquote tolerability, but what that means is not entirely obvious. And to suggest that it is obvious is to equate unequal things again, which might seem to be what Nietzsche is doing here by equating the masses, but in a very important sense, he isn't. I think from the angle I would look at it, he's implying the absolute individuality of every member of the populace and how when the most average values among the entire populace are selected for, the individual differences between them necessarily have to be smoothed over in that analysis. And it's almost like the collective subject that emerges is by necessity a narrow one because it can only be concerned with the most basic aspects, the most general needs, the most average values or set of values, that it doesn't actually end up representing anyone in some sense. And so it represents all and none, right? Some irony to that, maybe. So accordingly, Nietzsche goes on to imply that the anti-political person of today, the person who retreats into obscurity, can't be blamed for not taking the so-called happiness of the masses all that seriously, that they're the kind of people with the most individual and peculiar tastes and values. So they're the least accounted for person by the democratic incentive structure. And so the parties don't pander to them, right? They don't speak the same language in some sense. And so Nietzsche says that the goals of the, he he's speaking implicitly of the free spirit, right? The goals of the free spirit can't be grasped, he says, by any hand with 5 fingers. So by analogy, if the average person, the collective subject, can grasp about 5 or so concepts, this is a completely different level of communication from that of the free spirit, a different level of thought. And so it becomes almost mutually incomprehensible. One of the best examples of what Nietzsche is getting at here, which I think will be useful if it's still not exactly clear what he means by this, we find this in literature. It's in Orwell's 1984. So that's a totalitarian state in which everyone's lives are surveilled and controlled. Everything is within the command of a single party that runs everything. They're in a constant state of war, and the language itself is very tightly controlled, along with the press, and I'm sure most people know the rough outline of what happens in 1984, right? You have the Ministry of Truth that declares what's true and what isn't. But the interesting aspect I want to talk about is from the essay at the end, explaining the principles of Newspeak, which is the new simplified English of the party that controls this totalitarian state. In Newspeak, all of the concepts become as simple as possible, and nuanced ideas are intentionally made impossible to express in this new development of the English language that's entirely reshaped by Newspeak, right? Concepts such as those indicated by the Declaration of Independence, Orwell says this would be inexpressible in this new language, right? The only way that someone who only spoke Newspeak would be able to interpret these words is just with the term crime think. That would be the most straightforward way to summarize the principles of the Declaration of Independence, because you wouldn't even have a concept of something like freedom in a positive sense, right? And so Newspeak is fascinating because, for one, Orwell indicates that this is what would happen to language if control of the language were given over to a supremely powerful political party. So that's interesting. But also, in Orwell's novel, the party's most important lever of control is the ideology itself, right? As Wilson is being tortured at the end in their re-education camp during his imprisonment, O'Brien, his torturer, tells him that they, unlike the tyrants of the past, don't create martyrs. They don't allow anyone to go to the grave in stalwart resistance to their ideology. It's imperative that all are converted and made to bow before their ideology, to become partisans in their minds, not just outwardly. They don't want people who simply mouth the words. What the party wants is to transform people's inner lives, transform their souls. And that's why language, again, becomes so important, and why Orwell includes that element, because language is the chief means of reshaping thought. And the party's long-term goals are to make Newspeak the sole language of their state. So a dumbed-down, simplified, ideological form of speech that reshapes the thought, the inner thought of everyone, into the most simplified, narrow-minded collective terms, right? The entire disappearance of the individuality of thought. So Orwell is taking the principle that Nietzsche is working from here, and he turns it up to the extreme to show us this dystopian, literary setting. But we see a lot of Newspeak in the political landscape as we experience it today, right? Anytime people attempt to shape the dialogue in terms of the series of slogans that are designed to shut down debate, make things simple, right? Whenever someone says, let me be clear, let me make this very simple, and they have a pithy one-sentence summation of their idea, that's what they're doing. And Nietzsche's description of the free spirit here is that he or she is immune to Newspeak. They're the kind of people whose thoughts can't be made so narrow as to be confined in that manner. Okay, so the next aphorism, immediately after attacking democracy, Nietzsche attacks egalitarianism. But he does so in terms that are relatively familiar, I would say, within our modern system, if we reflect on the nature of our own economic and political hierarchy. It's actually not so different from some modern ideas. But so here's number 439, quote, A higher culture can come into being only where there are two castes of society, the working caste and the idle caste, capable of true leisure, or to express it more emphatically, the caste of forced labor and the caste of free labor. The distribution of happiness is not a crucial factor when it is a matter of engendering a higher culture. But the caste of the idle is in fact more capable of suffering and does suffer more. Its contentment in existence is slighter, its task greater. Now, if there should be an exchange between the two castes, so that duller, less spiritual individuals and families from the higher caste are demoted into the lower, and conversely, the freer people from that caste gain admission into the higher, then a condition has been achieved beyond which only the open sea of indefinite desires is still visible. Thus the fading voice of the old era speaks to us. Where are the ears left to hear it? End quote. So what I mean by suggesting that this is reflective of our modern system is that this is, in essence, what meritocracy promises to do, what technocracy to some extent promises to do. These ideologies that sort of exist in the context of our modern democratic capitalist systems, that through their merits, those who perform well in their education will be funneled into the upper classes of society, and that those who squander their wealth or badly educate their children, right, or prove themselves to be dullards, those rich people or members of the elite will inevitably find themselves sort of fall out of the elite. And, largely people, I guess, would say they would attribute market forces to being one of the main things that would do this, right? The fascinating thing as regards Nietzsche's philosophy is that he seems open to harmonizing the modern moral aspect of freedom, freedom to grow and expand beyond any set station in life, and to self-determine, right? To better yourself and do anything that you feel you're capable. He's harmonizing that idea that we moderns really enjoy with his aristocratic outlook that he really enjoys, such that he has this brutal understanding of society as always consisting of those who labor for their own inner drive, and then those who have to be forced to labor and produce things for the sake of those people who labor of their own inner drive. But he sees the possibility to harmonize this, and with the social mobility that will sort of, those two things together will open up this horizon of countless new goals. And that this synthesis is perhaps how one could take the energy of democracy and implement it in a way so as not to run afoul of respecting the inevitable inequality between people. Now, the question of our society is always whether we have actually effectively done this. And I would certainly challenge that sentiment, that the meritocracy actually works the way it's intended to work. It seems that in many cases people succeed by luck, and people who should have failed don't because they simply have too much starting capital or the right connections or what have you. And perhaps that the relevant structures within the market aren't really individuals, but have turned out to be, in the long run, these corporate entities which exist beyond any one individual and are sort of offer a liability shield to individuals who do dumb things. And capitalism has always been about mitigating risk, right? That's sort of how we have the explosion of capitalism, is with the corporation and how it mitigates the risk in the individual. So market forces, you can make a lot of really bad decisions, but if you've mitigated your risk sufficiently and you have enough starting capital, you can be insulated from that failure actually removing you from the patriciate, right? And a lot of people do fail upwards when you have bureaucracies that are structured in a deranged way. So I'd question whether the meritocracy we've created actually exists. But on the other hand, it's a case similar to the way I talked about Kant's political philosophy last time, right? In Nietzsche's vision here, we have something that's not too far off from the ideal that we espouse, even if we don't attain to it in practice. So that's at least interesting. But again, so why is it that Nietzsche wishes to preserve that aristocratic ethos? And it's because of that production of genius, right? It's something that's only possible within the state. And we also pride our meritocratic system today for selecting for that, which is also just as questionable of an idea. But anyway, Nietzsche offers a complication on that idea for us. in number 474, which is entitled Development of the Spirit Feared by the State. And what this passage suggests is that the state, the very thing that creates the opportunity for genius, is also by its very nature a force of stasis, of preservation. And the state will naturally regard the genius's ability to transform culture as a danger, just as Plato regarded artistic genius as a danger, right? And so here we see the nature of will to power, its sort of cyclical character represented again for a force to also contain its own decline. We talked about this to some extent in the episode concerning Nietzsche's earlier view on the state. The state is a means, but by the very nature of its power, it will try to become an end unto itself. So it becomes an idol, becomes an ossifying force. It attempts to preserve itself exactly as it is. And so it tries to abandon becoming for being. And so the state is a force that makes the flourishing of genius possible, but it's also, however, hostile to genius in this paradoxical way. So Nietzsche writes in 474, quote, like every organizational political power, the Greek polis spurned and distrusted the increase of culture among its citizens. Its powerful natural impulse was to do almost nothing but cripple and obstruct it. The polis did not want to permit to culture any history or revolution. The education determined by the law of the land was intended to bind all generations and keep them at one level. Later, Plato too wanted it no different for his ideal state. So culture developed in spite of the polis, though the polis helped indirectly, of course, and involuntarily, because in it, the individual's ambition was stimulated greatly, so that he pursued that too, as far as it would go. One should not evoke Pericles' panegyric as a refutation, for it is only a greatly optimistic delusion about the allegedly necessary connection between the polis and the Athenian civilization. Just before the night falls on Athens, the plague and the break with tradition, Thucydides lets it shine resplendent again, like a transfiguring sunset, at whose sight we are to forget the bad day that went before it. End quote. So Pericles' panegyric is his famous speech where he calls Athens the academy of the Greek world and stirs the Athenians to fight for the greatness of Athens as a city of learning and culture, which he attributes to their democratic character, right? It's funny because Nietzsche even goes so far as to call the polis only allegedly connected to the creation of Athenian civilization, which is one of those views that I think he would later repudiate, just as earlier Nietzsche would have repudiated it. But the important part is identifying this tendency of states, as Nietzsche would write much later in Genealogy of Morality, that states are always founded out of what he calls the artist's violence. They're founded by warlike people. They emerge out of violent conflict. So they come from like a vital dynamic, a people who are closer to nature, right? But the nature of the state organization is to wish to preserve itself against all change. And so hostility then to the development of culture, like we might think of the zombie institution still shambling on in its structure, even though the beliefs of the people have totally changed. And, another aspect of the passage that doesn't necessarily directly relate to politics, but that we see there is that his view that so much of what we have from the intellectual productions and artistic productions of ancient Greece are from the time of its decline, right? It was the end of Athenian civilization. It was its sunset. But that's when you get the best productions of culture, right, are in the decadent period before the end comes. One of the most interesting things that Nietzsche says is in aphorism 446. He compares socialistic energy to being like steam emitted from the earth. It can be a source of energy, right? He says that princes shouldn't ask themselves, how far should I yield to socialism's demands? That's entirely the wrong question. They should think of how they can use this energy to their own advantage. They should ask, how can the demands of the socialists serve my own ends? It's very Machiavellian, and in keeping with the pattern here of accepting the ascendance of these new ideas while still standing aside from them, not actually buying into them, right? We see this Machiavellian thread again in aphorism 453 when Nietzsche writes that, quote, the statesman creates public passions in order to profit from a counterpassion that they awake. To take an example, a German statesman knows well that the Catholic Church will never have the same plans as Russia, indeed that it would rather ally itself with the Turks than with Russia. He likewise knows that Germany is greatly threatened by the danger of an alliance of France with Russia. Now, if he can succeed in making France the hearth and home of the Catholic Church, he will have eliminated this danger for a long time to come. Thus, he has an interest in showing hatred toward the Catholics, and by hostilities of all kinds, transforming believers in the Pope's authority into a passionate political power that is inimical to German politics and must naturally merge with France as Germany's adversary. He aims, as necessity, at the Catholicization of France, as Mirabeau saw the salvation of his fatherland in its de-Catholicization. End quote. I think observations like that, it could have come straight out of Machiavelli. If you were to take Machiavelli and put him in Europe in the 19th century, he might say something similar. I love the 4D chess game that Nietzsche is playing there. The wise German statesman will be hostile to the Catholicism, not because he actually dislikes Catholicism, but because he knows France, as Germany's rival, will become all the more Catholic. And we see this happen in both international and domestic politics all the time. People look at their enemy and their enemy's depictions of them and say, yes, I will become exactly the devil that you fear. I will embody the evil you think I am. That's why the rightoids talk about triggering the libs and adopt this whole antagonistic language designed just to make people angry. Or the way people on the left, they celebrated when unvaccinated people died of coronavirus and wrote articles about how it was good to celebrate that, right? So knowing this tendency is there, you play into it, become super anti-Catholic in order to make your adversary become super pro-Catholic because you know the Catholic Church will push them away from another potential ally. So you get them to voluntarily drive a wedge between themselves and a potential ally, and you do this to your own advantage. Again, unsystematic passage, this doesn't really relate to his broader ideas. I just think it's kind of brilliant. Now, in two aphorisms, 440 and 441, Nietzsche makes a couple arguments which will make sense in light of his conception of obedience and command as that sort of essential function or the essential structure of willing, we might say. And so the state, as an objectification of the will, therefore replicates this. So he makes an aristocratic argument insofar as people with aristocratic lineage, as he writes, he says they're raised in an environment where they have to cultivate the ability to obey, to follow the rules of courts and manners and etiquette, and to memorize protocols and sublimate one's immediate desires to the fulfillment of one's duties, and so on and so forth. This is part of a process that, through obedience, raises them for command. But Nietzsche says that this kind of, enculturation, it can no longer grow in our cultural climate. And then in aphorism 441, he says that subordination that's valued so highly in military and bureaucratic states will soon cease to exist. That the kind of subordination needed, say in the context of the military command structure, will become rarer and harder to find. He writes, quote, "Subordination must vanish, for its basis is vanishing. Belief in absolute authority, in ultimate truth." End quote. So it's a very early consideration on the path to the death of God notion, right? That the metaphysical and moral values that are deep beneath the culture are shifting, and that modes of life that depend on those old values will not survive the shift, or they'll have to change in some way. So, again, that's an implicit criticism of democracy. It's destroying the basis of obedience and command. In democracy, everyone thinks of himself as his own king. Everyone's raised to follow their own dreams. The aristocratic traditions are disappearing because they really have no basis anymore. No one obeys them because the belief in absolute authority is gone. And consequently, the aristocrats themselves even have less of a desire to put any weight into their culture of command and duty and trappings and manners of court, because why would they? It becomes hollow and superficial, right? In one of the aphorisms to follow, entitled Hope as Arrogance, Middle Nietzsche provides another great example of how he's the same, but also different from later Nietzsche. He says that it's a certainty that our social order will melt away. But when it comes to the question of whether one should desire that it melt away, one could only believe this if they had inexhaustible hope. And such a hope would constitute arrogance, because it's the arrogance of believing that one's own values will be what obtains after the fall of the current order, when in all likelihood they won't be. It'll just be a return to the mean, right? A return to barbarism. It's the same as later Nietzsche, because he expresses this fatalistic view of politics, but later he has this attitude of confronting danger as an opportunity and sort of celebrating everything that's necessary, such that if our social order melting away is necessary, in some sense it must be celebrated, right? And we get this attitude even as early as in The Gay Science, right? But here he seems more opposed to anyone who would bring on the fall of the social order, from that same sentiment he expressed in the aphorism we read at the beginning, the distrust of all revolutions. And so, strangely enough, as an aristocratic rebel in his later work, Nietzsche actually ends up being less reactionary than he is here in the middle period. Because, at least in his later work, he welcomes change and transformation, whereas here, he more enthusiastically buys into the idea of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is sort of the rule of the day, or that's where he sees the change irresistibly flowing towards. And so going against that current to him seems inadvisable. And, derailing the entire thing is also inadvisable. And so he is more reactionary, sort of in favor of values that he doesn't even seem to hold, because he's treating the social order as a good unto itself. And maybe that is the main way of explaining the main difference, where later Nietzsche would sort of say, well, if a social order is going to melt away, we should welcome that, because the change and destruction, the opportunity for something new, is a good unto itself, right? All of that being said, too, I think you can even find Nietzsche maybe even making remarks that might be at least implicitly contradictory in his own work on this topic. So it's not exactly even a neat issue of defining what middle Nietzsche means versus later Nietzsche, because even in the same book, he opposes himself. But, I waver on this from day to day as well. So, and I think there's also an analogy to modern times that we could use or draw upon, that in some sense, the progressive of today has become a conservative, to the extent that his values actually map rather neatly onto the zeitgeist of society and where it's clearly headed. So when a progressive perceives that they're actually gaining ground and they're seeing their values reflected in the institutions, you see how they then begin to defend the institutions, even if they're capitalistic, right? The progressive left begins to identify more with the status quo, or at least with the direction of the current status quo. And so, whereas there are so-called conservatives who now even question the legitimacy of all institutions and would welcome their destruction, even if that brings on uncertainty, which means then that they're not really conserving anything. They're not really conservative, right? They want to revolt and progress to something else. And so it seems as though Nietzsche inhabits both those positions, whereas here in the middle period, he's like an Enlightenment realist, a type of progressive conservative. And then in his later period, he's someone who says, bring on the violent change, because we've run astray of life. And so he's like a reactionary revolutionary, right? Okay. Anyway, we'll move on. Okay. So this following passage contains an aphorism that's one of Nietzsche's most important, insofar as it also points the way to that cyclical character of the will to power idea. And it's entitled simply War. This is number 444. Quote, "One can say against war that it makes the victor stupid and the vanquished malicious. In favor of war, one can say that it barbarizes through both these effects and thus makes man more natural. War is the sleep or winter time of culture. Man emerges from it with more strength, both for the good and for the bad." End quote. So we have a view here that I think is more, when I said the view of his contemporaries, there was certainly a peace movement in the 19th century. Don't get me wrong in that. But it's a view that you don't really see much exist past much of the 19th century, right? It's the view that war ennobles. Here Nietzsche says that it barbarizes us, and he means that with a positive connotation. It keeps us from becoming too complacent under the safety of civilization. It keeps us still touching the state of nature. We still become subjected to the tests of survival that nature imposes. It's dangerous because of the consequences it has, right? The establishment of relationships of power and domination. And here, within just these couple of phrases, Nietzsche even indicates where that all leads, how it establishes these cycles of domination that characterize human history, because the victor becomes stupid. What does that mean? It means strength is self-defeating. I'll use maybe a vulgar analogy from a comic book film. In Dark Knight Rises, there's a wonderful line where Bane tells Batman before breaking his back, victory has defeated you. You know, you defeated all the mafia, you defeated all the organized crime, you cleaned up the city, and in your success, you atrophied. You became a hermit, you became weak, and now you can't oppose it when this external threat comes in to destroy what you've created. So, on the other hand, war is the wintertime of culture because it provides that reprieve from the task that can only be created by the state. It can only be created by order, which is the productions of culture. And that reprieve is necessary because if a society becomes solely wrapped up in the advancement of the arts and sciences and it abandons warfare and stops expanding, it eventually becomes, that atrophy sets in and it becomes susceptible to outside invasion. John Glubb talks about this. It's in an essay. I discussed it in that first episode of the two-part episode we did on the Antichrist. And so meanwhile, when Nietzsche says that war makes the vanquished malicious, we might appeal to a classic example from antiquity, the Gallic commander Brennus telling the Romans, "Ve victis, woe to the vanquished." Well, the Romans took that woe and held on to it and nursed it, and hundreds of years later felt justified and, in fact, ecstatic about the process of killing perhaps millions of Gauls in a war of conquest under Julius Caesar, and a war of extermination to a large part, in which their entire race is enslaved or brought into the Roman Empire in some way. People in states, for that matter, don't just forget past slights. Whenever they cannot requite injury with injury, that builds up resentment and it engenders future conflict. This is, in the roughest outline, Nietzsche's later conception and genealogy of morals, and seeing Christianity as like centuries of resentment of a perpetual slave class that could never discharge that resentment physically. And so that, then the problem becomes that revenge is being taken on a spiritual level, on the psychological level. But just in that, what is it called? Passage just entitled simply War, number 444 in Human All Too Human, there's so much condensed into that little idea that it almost prefigures the entire genealogy of morals. Nietzsche goes even further in a later section, 477, entitled War Essential. In this passage, he says that one should not expect much from mankind once it ceases to wage war. It's the exact opposite of Kant's position in perpetual peace, right? That the pursuit of peace would not drive mankind forward for Nietzsche, but stunt our development. And he says there's no other way of revitalizing an exhausted people. And by the way, we'll cover this later in the season, but there's a theory of history that kind of backs this up, that facing an external existential threat is one of the things that can galvanize cooperation within your society and lead to like a restoration during a time when the social order is fraying at the edges. And there are numerous examples in history of this. But in any case, Nietzsche, through this consideration about war, he anticipates more of his later insights, particularly that of sublimation, that the will to power, if not able to be expressed in terms of physical control of space, will have to be expressed in other subtler ways. He uses the example of the English, who he says seem to have attempted to renounce war, but now, quote, They have undertaken dangerous voyages of discovery, crossed oceans, climbed mountains, for scientific purposes, as it is said, but in truth to bring surplus energy home with them from every sort of adventure and danger. People will discover many other surrogates for war, but perhaps that will make them understand ever more clearly that such a highly cultivated, and therefore necessarily weary humanity as that of present-day Europe needs not only wars, but the greatest and most terrible wars." End quote. And how right he was that Europe would eventually find it necessary to engage in the greatest and most terrible wars. But was that something that we should celebrate? Well, cause for celebration or not, if we accept it as a necessary and inevitable development, look at the fruits of culture that Europe has reaped in the aftermath of these great wars, right? And the long peace that it attained. And now, in the wake of that, most of us, having not had to engage in war since that time, we find ourselves averse to it. And a lot of people are terrified of that prospect ever coming back. So the criticisms in opposition to Kant, though his name remains unspoken here, occur throughout this whole section in a like manner. He ends the chapter with the aphorism, quote, "Public opinions, private laziness," end quote, which calls to mind Kant's conception of one's role as both a public and private individual, and our duty to express our public opinions in order to improve our institutions, right? Nietzsche thinks that the advancement of our reason never comes from this public dialogue, and then it can't come through institutions. He says that education, when it occurs in a large bureaucratic system managed by the state, will always be mediocre. Quote, "For the same reason that cooking in large kitchens is at best mediocre," end quote. He makes another interesting remark about institutions in number 466 when he says that, quote, "The overthrow of beliefs is not immediately followed by the overthrow of institutions. Rather, the new beliefs live for a long time in the now desolate and eerie house of their predecessors, which they themselves preserve because of the housing shortage," end quote. So those are the zombie institutions I mentioned before. You know, the institution is a slow and lumbering thing. It doesn't absorb new ideas quickly or easily, and when the new ideas take over, it's so gradual that, you know, the content changes without changing the structure, right? Without changing the outward form, which can have a bizarre or unexpected effect on how the beliefs are manifested in policy, right? It's not as simple as persuading the institutions to change their beliefs, because the very structure of their power might require those beliefs as a basis. And, you know, in a way, that aphorism, I think, there are a lot of considerations or thought paths you could go down from those considerations, but Nietzsche just sort of gives us the little food for thought there. In another section entitled "Use of the Smallest Dishonesty," it's an aphorism that is also a rebuke to Kant's idea in What is Enlightenment of individuals fulfilling their duty of the public use of reason, right? And that this will somehow lead to the advancement of mankind. Nietzsche thinks this is a mistake, and he employs a similar framework in his criticism to that of his criticism of party politics, that it drives everything toward the average, and the most average values will be the worst values, the simplest, the narrowest, the stupidest values, right? And so there, his concern is with the incentives to appeal to the greatest number possible, and that therefore all those incentives will aggregate to cause all political communication to manifest as these great frescoes of stupidity. And so here it's a very similar concern, but he's talking more with the press, or you might say with just the idea of free expression generally. And Nietzsche's concern is with the little incentives to lie or to misrepresent or to withhold the truth. So again, the issue is not that every person is a liar, right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying that we all have incentives to tell little lies, especially little lies of omission, to simply tell ourselves, well, that's not important and I don't have to talk about it, to not focus on it, and that these little lies will aggregate and in their cumulative effect have a great impact on the society. This is aphorism number 447, quote, "The power of the press consists in the fact that every individual who serves it feels only slightly pledged or bound to it. He usually gives his opinion, but sometimes does not give it, in order to help his party or the politics of his country, or even himself. Such little misdemeanors of dishonesty, or perhaps only of dishonest reticence, are not hard for the individual to bear, and yet the consequences are extraordinary because these little misdemeanors are committed by many people at the same time. Because it seems that writing one line more or less, and perhaps even without a signature, makes no difference morally. A man who has money and influence can turn any opinion into a public one. Whoever realizes that most people are weak in small things and wants to attain his own purposes through them is always a dangerous human being." End quote. So, and I think Nietzsche's opinion here is actually more reflected in the modern world than Kant's. It's in terms of not the modern world's idealism, but in terms of what we put into practice. The millions of little misdemeanors of dishonesty committed by the press, how the media organizations of both political persuasions, they generally don't just outright lie about what the other side said or did, or outright lie about the facts. I mean, sometimes they do, but not usually. Usually it's just by not covering the concerns or not covering the stories that fit the narratives of the other side. That you just sort of fudge the truth, right? You commit a little dishonest reticence. Maybe even tell yourself as a reporter, well, that story's not important anyway. And collectively, the whole press does this, such that Kant's vision of everyone applying their public reason in this great discourse in the realm of free expression doesn't actually happen. And the reason why is because this public expression is shaped by all these little moral licenses, that we give ourselves to bend the truth to our own advantage. That there is advantage that is expressed or manifest, or the pursuit of pleasure, or a pursuit of vanity, or as Nietzsche would later say, will to power, that does affect how people express themselves and express this apparent use of just their reason in pursuit of the truth. And that even though these lies may be small, they're so numerous that the overall discourse becomes deranged and is driven towards this habitual distortion. And so again, the pattern with Nietzsche's thought here is that by a universal distribution of power, in this case, power of the press, we don't even get the outcome we hope to achieve because the very act of universalizing drives the outcome toward the average. It drives the outcome toward dishonesty, toward whatever serves the advantage of the most people. The outcome is never actually a collective striving for the truth, because that's not the kind of thing that the average person actually does. Would be, maybe to go a little bit beyond what Nietzsche's saying here, but that's the kind of like rarefied pleasure of the free spirit, is to be the kind of person who wants to seek the truth, because the truth is hard, it's cold, right? It doesn't set you free. It's actually quite painful. So most people don't do that. At the same time, Nietzsche seems to view public criticism as a positive force, insofar as he writes in 468, "The institutions which are safeguarded from criticism at all times, like the Senate or academic institutions are the examples that he uses, they have an innocent corruption that springs up within them, like mushrooms growing in the night," right? And so we need the harsh wind of public criticism to clear away that corruption. So perhaps the problem is not the criticism itself. I mean, Nietzsche's being a critic here, but the democratization of the power of the press and the subordination of the press to principles of equal access or to market forces or what have you. Anything that selects for the average, for the lowest common denominator. That Nietzsche thinks that will always yield a bad effect. This dangerous person that Nietzsche mentioned earlier, right? The person who knows how men allow themselves small immoralities and wants to use that for his own purposes. Nietzsche describes someone who might fit this description in greater detail in Aphorism 460. He says the formula for what the masses call a great man is simply one who gives them pleasant things. But he says that it must appear to be one with great exertion. That this is how one seems to be a messianic figure, at least in appearance. That their actions took great effort and offered no advantage to themselves, but only benefited the people. Nietzsche gives a psychological explanation for this, saying, "Everyone admires a strong will because no one has it, and everyone tells himself that, if he had it, there would be no more limits for him and his egoism." End quote. Nietzsche says that beyond this, the only thing that a great demagogue really needs is to reflect the masses back to themselves. He says, let him have the characteristics of the masses so that they will not be ashamed of him. Quote, "Let him be violent, envious, exploitative, scheming, fawning, groveling, puffed up, or, according to the circumstances, all of the above." End quote. And I think there are one or two figures of recent days that completely reflect this type of the man of the masses. Nietzsche thinks that the most threatening people to the social order are not those who would overthrow it for their own sake, but for the sake of their grandchildren. Those are the ones who are the most powerful for good or ill because they're willing to die, right? They're willing to sacrifice themselves. And when they're when they're in alignment with the political project of your government, they'll be your best soldiers. But when they become malcontents, those are the kinds of people who are going to be willing to martyr themselves to destroy the social order, right? So along the lines of these considerations, Nietzsche invokes a bit of ancient wisdom here. He writes in 455, and I'm abridging here slightly, quote, "If a man has no sons, he has no full right to speak about the needs of a single matter of state. He has to have risked with the others what is most precious to him. Only then is he bound firmly to the state. The development of a higher morality depends on a man's having sons. This makes him unselfish, or more exactly, it expands his selfishness over time and allows him seriously to pursue goals beyond this individual lifetime." End quote. Of course, Nietzsche will not allow the malcontents of society and the socialistic upheavals and the coming meltdown of the social order to darken his spirits, right? He expresses here the same sentiment that he would later echo in Twilight of Idols, that one can't really fight the decadence which is inevitable, and that one shouldn't even want to do so, because, as we mentioned, so many of the greatest productions of art and culture happen here, in decadence, on the edge of creation and destruction. It's the archetype of Socrates, Wagner, so many of the flawed mentors of Nietzsche as he sees them. So he writes in Human All Too Human 465 that a people on its political sickbed, as he calls it, has a means of rejuvenating itself again, but that, quote, "culture owes its highest achievements to politically weakened times," end quote. Again, it's a bit of a tension with his earlier beliefs in the Greek state, that the state helps create genius. But then, here he says that culture owes its achievements to the state being weakened, right? It's also, but that doesn't fit with what he says, with war being the wintertime of culture, because that's where the sort of state of peace and safety that insulates you from the state of nature, the order created by the state, when you venture outside of that, so thus it's the wintertime of culture. But then he also makes his remarks about how in Athens the state was hostile to culture and culture developed in spite of it. So the relationship between state and culture, we can see there's some contradictions in Nietzsche's thought that arise in this period. But perhaps what we could see here, maybe some notion that will tie it all together, we might think of Machiavelli, who wrote that it was necessary for Theseus to find the Athenians scattered and dispersed in order for him to, achieve greatness and found the polity, right? It was necessary for Caesar to find himself condemned by the Senate and backed into a corner with, half a legion or so of warriors so that he could achieve the greatness of fighting his way to victory from this difficult position, that it's necessary for greatness to emerge, for there to be great adversity. So we can sort of see that principle at work here too. If Nietzsche does see some sort of danger and opportunity, right, a chance for transformation, he sees it in this chance for a new conception of what Europeanism is to be, right? What a new idea of Europe that can arise in the wake of the Enlightenment. And this is his conception of the good European, which is introduced in a passage entitled, quote, "The European Man and the Destruction of Nations." Nietzsche sees a number of cultural factors that are weakening the nationalistic form of self-identification. There is this unprecedented exchange of ideas. exchange of books and letters. The elite has become semi-nomadic. They live all around Europe. They identify less and less with their country of origin. Furthermore, all of the lower classes, the ones who aren't landowners, are even becoming nomadic in order to seek for work elsewhere than in their native land. And that, like democracy and socialism, this dissolution of national identification is inevitable. It's a resistless force. And so Nietzsche sees that the only counterbalance to this would be the agendas of certain national dynasties, but that won't succeed since it's not really to the material interest of the people to fight for those national dynasties anymore, right? And so he says, quote, "Once a man has understood this, he should be undaunted in presenting himself as a good European and should work actively in the merging of nations," end quote. And so what he goes on to present then is a pan-European attitude wherein one identifies with European civilization as a whole rather than any one nation or ethnicity. And Nietzsche here attributes the only motivating reason for anti-Semitism that still exists to these nationalistic sentiments that need to be overcome. So once those sentiments disappear, he says that the Jews, when accepted as part of the whole of this pan-European society, will be seen as one of its most useful elements. That every ethnicity, every society within Europe has something to offer, some role to play, and we'll all see this once we accept the destruction of nations in Europe, accept that it's already underway and that it's basically a foregone conclusion. And as the events have played out, in some sense, he is correct about this, right? Europe does see itself now as a united geopolitical entity with a shared destiny to some extent, such that the members do not feel their future to solely depend on themselves, but on the maintenance of these relationships, these trade relationships and defensive pacts and so on and so forth. And the borders are all open, right? Europeans freely cross them. They have a federated system with an overarching government, even though, national identity still exists. There's certainly an element of this good Europeanism that is very much alive and well today. It's difficult to say how I would articulate the overall thrust of all these observations, since Nietzsche's experimenting here, and he's re-examining things. He's feeling out difficult issues, and he's taking second and third steps from his initial frame of thought, and sometimes he proceeds in two different directions that are contradictory, right? But he leaves us with questions that we might consider. If the state is the iron clamp that creates genius, under what conditions can the state do this? And why does the state appear to oppose culture in some other respects? If we recognize that the status quo, as we see it, is proceeding in the negative direction, but we believe that direction to be inevitable and even necessary for it to unfold that way, then to what extent should we simply accept that status quo, and to what extent should we attempt to change it? What are the causes of these flaws that are inherent in democracy that all of the ancients identify? And could those causes be altered, or are they a necessary consequence of that system, right? Will you always have those factors that will cause democracy to produce these unwanted outcomes? Again, since this is only looking at politics at a glance, Nietzsche doesn't really leave us much in the way of an affirmative vision, but he leaves us with some very biting criticism. And so perhaps the best summary will be to look at one of the last aphorisms in the section in which Nietzsche critiques both the left and the right-wing political ideologies of his time. Underlying his criticism in this passage, which applies as much to our time as it does to his, in my opinion, is that theme throughout of the suspicion of universalism, the suspicion of distilling the good from the desires of the many. So Nietzsche writes in 480, quote, "The two opposing parties, the socialistic and the nationalistic, or however they are called in Europe's varied countries, deserve one another. In both of them, envy and laziness are the moving powers. In the one camp, people want to work as little as possible with their hands, in the other, as little as possible with their heads. In nationalism, men hate and envy the outstanding individuals who develop on their own and are not willing to let themselves be placed into the rank and file for the purpose of mass action. In socialism, men hate and envy the better caste of society, outwardly in a more favorable position, whose actual duty, the production of the highest goods of culture, makes life inwardly all the more difficult and painful. Of course, if one can succeed in turning the spirit of mass action into the spirit of the higher social classes, then the socialistic throngs are quite right to try and bring themselves, externally to the level of the former, since inwardly, in heart and head, they are already on the same level. Live as higher men, and persist in doing the deeds of higher culture. Then everything alive will grant you your rights, and the social order, whose peak you represent, will be preserved from any evil eye or hand." End quote. So, first, just to go over the basic aspects of the passage. The left wishes to do as little manual work, and the right wishes to do as little mental work as possible. The political wing that's closer to socialism, the left, in any system, they'll always be the advocate for the people who don't produce anything. Not that solely that's who they advocate for, but they will find their advocate on the left-hand side, right? The people who have to take from the system in order to survive. We see this with the phenomena like the anti-work movement on Reddit, right? There's usually a correlation with neuroticism there. So to put it simply, the right is stupid and the left is crazy, right? The right wants things to be the same forever, and in extreme circumstances doesn't ever want to acknowledge when a change might be necessary. But Nietzsche frames it in terms of laziness, right? It is the democratic tendency to select for mediocre averageness and elevate the values of such people to the highest. And thus both parties are distinguished here by the sense in which they wish to cater to a particular kind of weakness, right? Because that's what the quote-unquote average person, the democratic collective subject, always wants. He's not exceptional and may be lacking in many qualities, and he wants to establish systems to protect him from his own failings. And neither side of political thinking gets away from this. Both sides offer this in different ways. Because once they manifest into a political party, those incentives go to work, and all their principles become narrower and narrower, and more average. Secondly, however, he implies something very subtly at the end, that the nobility, the people who promote the higher culture, must live as higher men to preserve the social order, which implies that if the people in the so-called higher culture do not appear to be higher men, then you have a problem on your hands. They will not be able to maintain that social order. And in fact, Nietzsche thinks that this is exactly what happened, that ignoble people made their way into the nobility. The mere fact of their acquisition of power didn't make them masters. And that's perhaps the oft overlooked undercurrent of the genealogy of morals, of the message there. Insofar as Nietzsche's conceptions of competing values in that work, he shows values to span centuries and civilizations. One can carry forward values from ages that are long dead, meaning that culture can survive in spite of changing material conditions. And so you can have the slave morality and move into the material conditions of being from all outward appearance as a master, but still have the values of the slave. You can still be petty, vindictive, cruel. The process of liberalization in Europe, of liberalizing governance, liberalizing the religion, and yes, liberalizing the markets, opened the way for people with no virtue to walk into the halls of power. And true, the system before this was never even close to perfect, but Nietzsche believes that liberal society compounds the problem 1,000-fold. Now when the people look up to their supposed betters, they don't see a fighting aristocracy, people who had to defend their claim on power, right? Instead, in the famous politicians, in the bureaucratic chiefs, in the captains of industry, they see people who are envious, exploitative, scheming, fawning, groveling, puffed up, or according to the circumstances, all of the above. In other words, a reflection of them. And in a way that undermines their legitimacy of their being an elite, right? Because how could they actually be elite if they're just like me and they have all of my own faults? This is the basis of his criticism of liberal democracy and Nietzsche's criticism of capitalism. We're going to cover that in more detail next week. Join me then for a non-Marxist critique of capitalism, Nietzsche contra capital. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.